In the dusty frontier town of Copper Ridge, Montana Territory, everyone knew Sarah Mitchell as the struggling widow with 3 strong sons and a failing homestead. When the giant cowboy Brutus bull Garrison demanded she hand over her boys to work his dangerous cattle drives, the townspeople whispered it was only a matter of time before she'd have no choice but to comply. They watched her fight desperately to keep her family together on a ranch that seemed cursed by misfortune and mounting debt. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed. Because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. But beneath the cracked earth of her modest property lay a secret that would change everything. Hidden for decades in the abandoned copper mines that bordered her land was a fortune in precious metals worth over $8 million, left untouched. Since the territorial mining rush of the 1860s, the moment Sarah discovered that glittering treasure, her name went from pitied widow to the most powerful woman in Montana Territory. Suddenly, the same giant who had threatened to take her sons was desperately trying to win her favor. Will Sarah's newfound wealth give her the strength to protect her family from those who would exploit them? Or will it paint an even bigger target on their backs? The morning sun cast long shadows across the weathered fence posts of the Mitchell homestead as Sarah Mitchell carried a bucket of feed toward the chicken coop, her worn boots crunching on the frost-covered ground. At 42, she moved with the determined efficiency of a woman who had learned that every task completed was a small victory against the forces trying to destroy her family. Her auburn hair, streaked with premature gray from years of worry and hard work, was braided back in a practical style that kept it out of her face during the endless hours of ranch work. The black wool dress she wore had been her finest garment once, worn to church socials and town gatherings when her husband Robert was alive. Now it served as her everyday work clothes, its fabric faded and patched, but still maintaining the dignity. She refused to surrender despite her circumstances. Around her neck hung a simple gold locket containing a photograph of Robert taken on their wedding day in 1863, back when the future had seemed bright with promise and possibility. Sarah had been just 19 when she married Robert Mitchell, a hardworking man with dreams of building a cattle empire in the Montana Territory. Together, they had carved their homestead from the wilderness, raising 3 sons while fighting drought, harsh winters, and the constant challenges of frontier life. Robert's death from pneumonia 3 winters ago had left Sarah not just heartbroken, but struggling to manage a ranch that required the strength and experience she was still learning to develop. The sound of approaching horses made her look up. From scattering chicken feed, shading her eyes against the morning glare to see her 3 sons riding home from their dawn patrol of the property lines. Thomas, her eldest at 19, sat tall in his saddle with the natural grace of someone born to ranch life. His dark hair and serious brown eyes reminded Sarah so much of his father that sometimes it took her breath away. Behind him rode James, 17 and eager to prove himself as capable as his older brother, his sandy hair catching the sunlight as he guided his horse with confident hands. Samuel, the youngest at 15, brought up the rear on his smaller mare, his face still showing traces of the boy he had been before responsibility had forced him to grow up too quickly. The 3 young men had become the foundation of Sarah's world since Robert's death, working from dawn to dusk to keep their small ranch operational. They branded cattle, mended fences, broke horses, and handled every aspect of ranching that would normally require a crew of experienced cowboys. Their dedication and skill had kept the Mitchell homestead functioning when everyone expected it to fail. But Sarah could see the toll that constant work was taking on boys who should have been thinking about courting girls and planning their own futures. "Morning, Ma," Thomas called out as he dismounted near the barn, his voice carrying the weariness of someone who had been up since 4 o'clock checking on newborn calves. Found 2 head missing from the north pasture. Tracks suggest they wandered toward Devil's Canyon sometime during the night. The news sent a chill through Sarah that had nothing to do with the morning cold. Devil's Canyon was part of the vast range controlled by Brutus Garrison, and cattle that wandered onto his land had a way of never finding their way home. More troubling was the possibility that the missing cattle hadn't wandered at all, but had been deliberately driven away by riders working for the giant rancher who had been pressuring Sarah to sell her property for months. "We'll ride out after breakfast and see if we can track them," James added, unsaddling his horse with the practiced movements of someone who had been handling livestock since childhood. If they crossed onto Garrison land, we might be able to convince his foreman to let us retrieve them. Sarah doubted that Bull Garrison's men would show any such consideration, but she nodded anyway, unwilling to burden her sons with her growing fears about their neighbors' intentions. The missing cattle represented a significant financial loss for a family that could ill afford to lose any assets. But more concerning was the pattern of harassment that had been escalating over the past several months. The kitchen of their modest ranch house smelled of bacon and fresh coffee as Sarah prepared breakfast for her family, the familiar routine providing comfort despite her worries. The room was small but well organized, with handmade furniture that Robert had crafted during their early years together and shelves lined with preserving jars that represented countless hours of Sarah's work preparing for the harsh Montana winters. A large wooden table dominated the center of the room, scarred by years of family meals and homework sessions, but polished to a warm shine that reflected the care Sarah took in maintaining their home. As her sons washed up for breakfast, Sarah found herself studying their faces and seeing not the capable young men they had become, but the babies she had rocked to sleep, the toddlers who had followed Robert around the ranch like devoted puppies, the boys who had cried when their father died and promised they would take care of her forever. The weight of responsibility they had shouldered at such young ages filled her with both pride and heartbreak, knowing that their childhood had been sacrificed to keep their family together. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Mrs. Mitchell, came a voice from the front porch, followed by a polite knock that nonetheless managed to sound ominous in the morning quiet. Sarah wiped her hands on her apron and opened the door to find Martha Stevens, the middle-aged woman, who ran the general store in Copper Ridge, standing on her porch with an expression of barely concealed anxiety. "Martha, what brings you out so early?" Sarah asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. Martha Stevens was not the type of woman to make social calls at dawn, and her presence suggested news that couldn't wait for a chance encounter in town. "I'm afraid I have some concerning information, Sarah," Martha replied, glancing nervously toward the barn where Sarah's sons were visible working with the horses. "Bull Garrison was in the store yesterday afternoon, making inquiries about your family. Specifically, he was asking about your boys and whether they might be interested in employment opportunities." The words hit Sarah like a physical blow, confirming her worst fears about Garrison's intentions. The giant rancher had built his empire through a combination of legitimate business practices and methods that skirted the edges of legality, including the recruitment of young men for dangerous work that paid well but often resulted in serious injury or worse. His interest in her sons represented a threat that went far beyond simple business competition. "What kind of employment?" Sarah asked, though she dreaded the answer. Martha's expression grew even more troubled. "He mentioned needing strong young men for his cattle drives to the railroad towns. The kind of work that takes boys away from home for months at a time and brings them back changed, if it brings them back at all." Sarah felt her world tilt as the implications of Martha's news sank in. Bull Garrison's cattle drives were notorious throughout the territory for their brutal conditions and high casualty rates. Young men who signed on for his crews often returned with injuries that left them unable to work, if they returned at all. The pay was generous enough to tempt families facing financial desperation, but the human cost was devastating. "He also mentioned that he might be willing to make a generous offer for your property," Martha continued, her voice dropping to a whisper. "Said that a woman alone with 3 boys to raise might find it difficult to manage such a large responsibility." The implicit threat in Garrison's message was clear. Sarah could sell her ranch to him at whatever price he deemed fair, or she could watch as he systematically destroyed her family by recruiting her sons for work that would either kill them or remove them from her life forever. The choice was designed to be impossible, forcing her to choose between her land and her children. After Martha left, Sarah sat at her kitchen table staring at the coffee cup in her hands while her mind raced through possibilities and options. Every scenario she could imagine ended with either the loss of her ranch or the loss of her sons, both outcomes that would destroy everything she and Robert had worked to build. The financial pressures of running the ranch had been mounting for months, with feed costs rising and cattle prices falling, making it increasingly difficult to meet their basic expenses. Thomas entered the kitchen and immediately sensed his mother's distress, his young face creasing with concern as he took the chair across from her. At 19, he had inherited not just his father's physical appearance, but also his ability to read people and situations with remarkable accuracy. His presence provided comfort, but also reminded Sarah of how much responsibility he had already shouldered and how much more he might be forced to bear. "What did Mrs. Stevens want?" he asked, gently, his tone suggesting he was prepared for bad news. Sarah made a decision to be honest with her eldest son about the threat they were facing, knowing that he deserved to understand the forces arrayed against their family. As she explained Garrison's interest in recruiting him and his brothers, she watched Thomas's expression shift from concern to anger to something resembling cold determination that reminded her powerfully of his father. "He can't force us to work for him," Thomas said finally, though his voice lacked the conviction his words suggested. "We're not children, and this is still a free territory." "Bull Garrison has ways of making people do what he wants," Sarah replied quietly. "He owns most of the land around here, employs half the men in the county, and has the kind of influence that makes law enforcement reluctant to challenge his decisions. If he decides he wants something, he usually finds a way to get it." The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of James and Samuel, who had finished their morning chores and were ready for breakfast. Sarah served them bacon, eggs, and fresh biscuits while trying to maintain an appearance of normalcy, but she could see that Thomas was struggling with the same effort. The weight of adult concerns was settling over her family like a dark cloud, stealing the simple pleasure of a shared meal and replacing it with the grim calculations of survival. As they ate, Sarah found herself studying each of her sons and trying to imagine their futures if Garrison succeeded in his plans. Thomas was strong and capable, with a natural leadership ability that would make him valuable to any ranching operation, but also dangerous to a man like Garrison who preferred employees who didn't think for themselves. James had inherited his grandfather's skill with horses and could gentle the most stubborn bronco with patience and understanding, talents that would make him sought after throughout the territory. Samuel was still growing into his strength, but he possessed a quick intelligence and natural curiosity that suggested he might find success in business or even law if given the opportunity. The thought of watching her sons disappear into Garrison's brutal operation, where their individual talents would be wasted and their lives endangered for the profit of a man who cared nothing for their welfare, filled Sarah with a rage that surprised her with its intensity. She had spent 3 years trying to honor Robert's memory by maintaining the ranch and keeping their family together, accepting help when necessary, and working harder than any woman should have to work, all in service of a dream that seemed increasingly impossible to achieve. But as she looked at her sons' faces around the breakfast table, Sarah made a silent promise that she would find a way to protect them from Bull Garrison's schemes, even if it meant sacrificing everything else she held dear. The ranch could be rebuilt, debts could be paid, and property could be replaced, but her boys were irreplaceable treasures that no amount of money could restore if they were lost. The morning sun climbed higher as the Mitchell family finished their breakfast and prepared for another day of the endless work that kept their ranch functioning. Sarah watched her sons saddle their horses and ride out to search for the missing cattle, their young faces set with determination despite the challenges they faced. The sight of them disappearing into the distance filled her with both pride and terror, knowing that every day brought new dangers and new threats to their survival. Standing on her front porch, Sarah touched the gold locket at her throat and whispered a prayer to Robert's memory, asking for the strength and wisdom to protect their children from forces that seemed too powerful to resist. The morning breeze carried the scent of sage and wildflowers across the prairie, reminding her of all the reasons they had fallen in love with this harsh but beautiful land. But beneath her feet, hidden in the forgotten copper mines that honeycombed the hills around her property, lay secrets that would soon transform her from a powerless widow into the most formidable woman in Montana Territory. The fortune that had been waiting in darkness for 20 years was about to emerge into the light, bringing with it the power to reshape not just Sarah's destiny, but the fate of everyone who had underestimated the strength of a mother fighting to protect her children. The abandoned copper mines had been part of the Mitchell property since Robert purchased the land 15 years earlier, but they had always seemed more like a liability than an asset. The previous owner had warned that the tunnels were unstable and dangerous, suitable only for storing equipment or providing shelter during severe weather. Sarah had respected those warnings, forbidding her sons from exploring the mine entrances and treating the underground passages as off-limits territory that posed unnecessary risks to their safety. But as financial pressures mounted in Bull, Garrison's threats became more explicit. Sarah found herself considering every possible resource that might help her family survive. The copper mines, with their network of tunnels and chambers carved into the hillside behind her ranch house, represented unexplored possibilities that she could no longer afford to ignore. If there was even a chance that valuable minerals remained in those dark passages, she owed it to her sons to investigate before accepting defeat. The woman who would one day stand up to the most feared man in Montana Territory began life as Sarah Elizabeth O'Brien, the daughter of Irish immigrants who had arrived in Boston with nothing but determination and faith in the American dream. Her father, Patrick O'Brien, had worked the docks while her mother, Bridget, took in laundry and mending to help support their growing family. Sarah learned early that survival required both backbreaking work and unwavering dignity, lessons that would serve her well in the years ahead. Growing up in the cramped tenements of Boston's Irish Quarter, Sarah had watched her parents transform themselves from desperate refugees into respected members of their community through sheer force of will and tireless effort. Patrick eventually saved enough money to open a small dry goods store, while Bridget became known throughout the neighborhood for her skill at nursing sick children and delivering babies. Their success came not from luck or privilege, but from an absolute refusal to accept defeat regardless of the obstacles placed in their path. Sarah's childhood had been marked by responsibility and sacrifice, as the eldest of 5 children who helped their parents navigate the challenges of building a life in a new country. She learned to read and write in the evening classes offered by the Catholic Church, taught herself basic arithmetic by helping her father with his store ledgers, and mastered the domestic skills that would make her invaluable as a frontier wife. But more importantly, she absorbed her parents' belief that no external force had the right to determine the fate of people willing to fight for their dreams. When Robert Mitchell arrived in Boston as a young man seeking investors for his Montana ranching venture, Sarah was working as a seamstress in a downtown shop while saving money to help her younger siblings attend school. Robert was tall and earnest, with calloused hands that spoke of honest work and gray eyes that lit up when he described the vast open spaces of the Western Territories. Their courtship was brief but intense, built on shared values and a mutual recognition that they possessed the strength to build something lasting together. The decision to leave Boston for the Montana Territory had been the most difficult of Sarah's life, requiring her to abandon the family and community that had shaped her character in favor of an uncertain future with a man she loved but barely knew. Her parents had given their blessing reluctantly, understanding that the opportunity Robert offered represented the kind of advancement that would never be available to their daughter in the crowded cities of the East. The tearful goodbye at the train station had been the last time Sarah saw her parents alive, as distance and the demands of frontier life made return visits impossible. The journey west had tested every aspect of Sarah's character and resolve. The train carried them as far as the established settlements, but the final approach to Robert's chosen homestead required weeks of travel by wagon over roads that existed more in theory than reality. Sarah had endured dust storms that left her choking and blinded, river crossings that threatened to sweep away everything they owned, and nights when the temperature dropped so low that survival seemed uncertain despite their careful preparations. But it was during those weeks of hardship that Sarah truly fell in love with both her husband and the land they would call home. Robert proved to be everything she had hoped, a man whose gentleness toward her was matched by his fierce determination to protect and provide for their growing family. The Montana Territory revealed itself as a place of stunning beauty and brutal challenges, where success depended entirely on personal character rather than social connections or inherited advantages. Their first winter together had nearly killed them both. The cabin Robert had built was sturdy but small, and their supplies ran dangerously low during a series of blizzards that lasted for weeks. Sarah learned to make bread from carefully rationed flour, to preserve meat in the freezing temperatures, and to create warm clothing from animal hides that Robert trapped and processed. She also learned that the isolation of frontier life could be either a blessing or a curse, depending on the strength of the partnership at its center. Thomas had been born during their second spring in Montana, arriving during a late snowstorm that prevented them from reaching the nearest town for medical assistance. Sarah had delivered her first child with only Robert's help, guided by instincts and prayers rather than experience or training. The successful birth had filled them both with confidence that they could handle whatever challenges the frontier might present, a belief that would be tested repeatedly in the years that followed. James arrived 2 years later under easier circumstances, born during the summer when travel was possible and a traveling doctor happened to be in the area. Samuel completed their family 3 years after that, his birth coinciding with Robert's most successful cattle drive and the expansion of their ranch to include additional grazing land. Each child brought new responsibilities and new motivations, transforming Sarah from a young bride into a formidable frontier matriarch who could handle any crisis with calm efficiency. The years of building their ranch had been filled with triumphs and disasters in equal measure. Harsh winters killed cattle and tested their financial reserves. Drought years forced them to drive their herds to distant water sources and purchase expensive feed to keep their livestock alive. Disease outbreaks could devastate their herd overnight, wiping out years of careful breeding and selection. But there were also good years when everything went right, when the cattle market was strong and their ranch prospered beyond their most optimistic projections. Sarah's role in their partnership had evolved far beyond traditional domestic responsibilities. She learned to brand cattle, to assist with difficult births among their livestock, to negotiate with buyers who tried to take advantage of what they assumed was Robert's lack of sophistication. Her quick mind for numbers made her invaluable during business discussions, while her ability to read people's character helped them avoid partnerships that would have proven disastrous. The social aspects of frontier life had required different adaptations. Copper Ridge was small enough that everyone knew everyone else's business, but large enough to support the institutions that made civilized life possible. Sarah had helped establish the town's first school, organized fundraising efforts to build a proper church, and served as an unofficial mediator when disputes arose between neighbors. Her reputation for fairness and common sense made her someone people turned to during crises, a role she accepted as both privilege and responsibility. The friendship she developed with Doc Henry Walsh and his family represented one of the few bright spots in her current circumstances. Doc Walsh was an educated man who had come west after losing his wife to cholera in St. Louis, bringing his young daughter Rebecca and a determination to serve communities that desperately needed medical care. His practice was more than a business. It was a calling that he pursued regardless of his patient's ability to pay. Sarah had assisted him during medical emergencies when extra hands were needed, learning basic nursing skills that proved invaluable when her own family faced health crises. Rebecca Walsh, now 17 and one of the most accomplished young women in the territory, had become like a daughter to Sarah and a source of obvious fascination for Thomas. The girl had inherited her father's intelligence and compassion, along with her late mother's beauty and social grace. Her education far exceeded what was typical for frontier women, as Doc Walsh had ensured she received the same classical learning that would have been available to wealthy girls in eastern cities. Rebecca's presence in their community represented hope for the future, proof that civilization and culture could flourish even in the harsh environment of the Montana Territory. Martha Stevens, who owned the general store with her husband William, had been Sarah's closest female friend and confidant during the difficult years following Robert's death. Martha understood the challenges facing women who had to manage business affairs in a world dominated by men, having taken over much of the store's operations when William's arthritis made physical work difficult. Her network of contacts throughout the territory made her an invaluable source of information about market conditions, political developments, and social changes that could affect the welfare of frontier families. The relationship between Sarah and Sheriff Frank Coleman was more complicated, shaped by her growing suspicions about his willingness to challenge Garrison's increasingly aggressive behavior. Coleman was not a corrupt man in the traditional sense, but he was practical enough to recognize that his ability to maintain order in the county depended on avoiding direct confrontations with the territory's most powerful rancher. His reluctance to investigate complaints against Garrison had created a climate of impunity that encouraged increasingly bold actions against smaller landowners. Sarah's financial education had come through necessity rather than formal training. But years of managing ranch operations had given her a sophisticated understanding of credit, investment, and risk management. She knew that their current debt levels were approaching the danger point, with outstanding loans secured by their land and livestock creating vulnerability that enemies could exploit. The missing cattle represented more than just immediate losses. They were part of a pattern of harassment designed to push the Mitchell family toward financial collapse. The physical demands of ranch work had transformed Sarah from the delicate seamstress who had left Boston into a woman capable of handling any task required for their survival. She could shoe horses, repair fences, treat sick animals, and perform dozens of other jobs that were traditionally considered men's work. Her hands bore the calluses and scars that testified to years of hard labor, while her arms and shoulders had developed the strength needed to handle heavy equipment and stubborn livestock. But it was the mental toughness that Sarah had developed over 20 years of frontier life that would prove most valuable in the challenges ahead. She had learned to make life-or-death decisions under pressure, to maintain hope during seemingly impossible circumstances, and to project strength even when fear threatened to overwhelm her. The woman who had once been intimidated by the vastness of the Montana Territory had become someone who could face down any threat to her family's welfare. The isolation that characterized much of frontier life had taught Sarah to rely on her own judgment rather than seeking consensus or approval from others. When problems arose, she was accustomed to analyzing situations independently and taking action based on her own assessment of the facts. This self-reliance would prove crucial when dealing with opponents who expected women to defer to male authority figures and who underestimated the determination of mothers protecting their children. Sarah's relationship with her sons had evolved as they matured from children into young men capable of sharing adult responsibilities. She had taught them not just the practical skills needed for ranch work, but also the values and principles that would guide their decisions throughout their lives. Thomas had inherited his father's natural leadership abilities and his mother's analytical mind, making him a formidable partner in managing their ranch operations. James possessed an almost supernatural ability to understand and communicate with animals, skills that made him invaluable during roundups and training sessions. Samuel's quick intelligence and natural curiosity suggested that he might eventually choose a different path than ranching, perhaps pursuing education or business, opportunities that his older brothers might create through their success. The religious faith that had sustained Sarah through the most difficult periods of her life was rooted in the Irish Catholic tradition of her childhood, but adapted to the realities of frontier existence. She believed that God helped those who helped themselves, that prayer without action was meaningless, and that protecting innocent people from evil was a sacred duty regardless of the personal cost. This practical spirituality gave her strength without making her passive, encouraging her to fight against injustice while maintaining hope that good would ultimately triumph over evil. The domestic skills that Sarah had mastered over 2 decades of frontier life represented a form of practical artistry that was essential for family survival. She could preserve food to last through harsh winters, create warm clothing from raw materials, maintain a comfortable home environment despite primitive conditions, and provide medical care for common injuries and illnesses. These abilities made her family more self-sufficient and less vulnerable to external pressures that might force them to make desperate compromises. The social relationships that Sarah had built throughout the territory formed a network of mutual support and information that would prove invaluable in the conflicts ahead. She knew which merchants could be trusted to provide fair deals and honest information, which families shared her values and could be counted on for assistance during emergencies, and which individuals were secretly allied with forces that threatened her family's welfare. This understanding of the human landscape was as important as knowledge of the physical terrain when planning strategies for survival and success. The loss of Robert had forced Sarah to develop aspects of her character that might otherwise have remained dormant. She had always been strong and capable, but widowhood had required her to become strategic and ruthless when necessary. The woman who had once deferred to her husband's judgment in business matters now made decisions that affected not only her family's immediate welfare, but their long-term prospects for prosperity and security. This evolution from supportive partner to independent leader would prove essential when facing enemies who expected her to collapse under pressure. The financial pressures that currently threatened her family were not just about money. They represented an attack on everything she and Robert had built together and everything she hoped to pass on to her children. The ranch was more than property. It was the physical embodiment of their shared dreams and the foundation for her sons' futures. Losing it would mean not just poverty, but the destruction of the legacy that justified all the sacrifices and hardships they had endured over 20 years of frontier life. Sarah's understanding of her opponents was based on careful observation and analysis rather than assumption or prejudice. She knew that Bull Garrison was not simply a brutal man who enjoyed causing suffering, but a calculating businessman who used intimidation and violence as tools for achieving specific economic objectives. His interest in her sons was not personal vindictiveness, but a practical assessment of their value as workers and their potential as threats to his dominance in the region. This knowledge would be crucial when developing strategies to counter his plans and protect her family from his schemes. The courage that Sarah would need to face the challenges ahead was not the absence of fear, but the willingness to act despite terror that threatened to paralyze her judgment. She was fully aware of the dangers posed by defying someone with Garrison's power and reputation, understanding that the consequences of failure could include not just financial ruin, but physical harm to herself and her children. But the love she felt for her sons and the duty she owed to Robert's memory created obligations that transcended personal safety, making heroism not a choice, but an inevitable expression of her deepest values. The transformation that would soon change Sarah from victim to victor was already beginning, though she did not yet recognize the early signs of her own empowerment. Years of frontier life had given her skills and knowledge that would prove invaluable when fighting powerful enemies, while the relationships she had built throughout the territory would provide the support network necessary for ultimate success. The woman who had once felt powerless against forces beyond her control was about to discover that true strength came not from wealth or position, but from the willingness to risk everything in defense of what mattered most. As Sarah stood in her kitchen that morning, watching her sons prepare for another day of dangerous work in a world that seemed determined to destroy them, she could not have imagined that beneath her feet lay the key to transforming every aspect of their circumstances. The abandoned copper mines that had always seemed like a liability were about to reveal themselves as the foundation for a fortune that would make the Mitchell family the most powerful force in Montana territory, giving Sarah the resources she needed to protect her children and destroy the enemies who threatened their future. The letter that changed everything arrived on a Tuesday morning in late August, delivered by a nervous postal clerk who seemed eager to complete his business and leave the Mitchell homestead as quickly as possible. Sarah was hanging laundry on the line behind her house when she heard the sound of approaching hooves, the rhythm too hurried and irregular to belong to any of her sons returning from their morning chores. The young man who dismounted near her front porch was dusty from hard riding, his horse lathered with sweat that suggested urgency rather than routine delivery. "Mrs. Sarah Mitchell?" he asked, consulting a piece of paper with official letterhead visible even at a distance. When Sarah nodded, he handed her an envelope bearing the seal of the Territorial Land Office, its weight and texture suggesting documents of considerable importance. This came through the express service from Helena. The sender paid extra to ensure immediate delivery. After the postal clerk departed, Sarah stood on her front porch holding the unopened letter while her mind raced through possibilities. Official correspondence from the territorial capital rarely brought good news for small ranchers, more often carrying notices of tax assessments, regulatory changes, or legal complications that could threaten their livelihood. The extra expense of express delivery suggested either extreme urgency or someone with significant resources who wanted her immediate attention. Inside the envelope were 3 separate documents, each bearing official seals and signatures that indicated their legitimacy. The first was a letter from the Montana Territorial Mining Office informing Sarah that recent geological surveys had identified her property as potentially containing valuable mineral deposits that might be subject to federal mining regulations. The second document was a formal notice that mining claims in her area were being reviewed for compliance with territorial and federal laws governing mineral extraction. The third was a purchase offer from something called the Western Territory Mining Consortium, proposing to buy her entire ranch for the sum of $12,000, payable immediately upon acceptance. $12,000 represented more money than Sarah had ever imagined possessing, enough to pay off all their debts, relocate her family to a safer area, and provide for her son's education and future prospects. The offer seemed too generous. For property that everyone considered marginal grazing land with little commercial value beyond its potential for supporting a modest cattle operation. But the same instincts that had kept her family alive during 20 years of frontier challenges. Whispered warnings about opportunities that seemed too good to be true. The timing of the offer was particularly suspicious, arriving just days after Bull Garrison had made his implied threats about recruiting her sons for his dangerous cattle operations. If powerful interests were suddenly competing for control of her property, it suggested that the Mitchell homestead possessed value that had been deliberately concealed from her family. The possibility that they had been struggling to survive on land that might actually be worth a fortune filled Sarah with a mixture of excitement and rage that someone had been manipulating them while they faced financial ruin. Sarah read through the documents multiple times, studying every clause and condition while trying to understand the true motivations behind such an unexpected windfall. The purchase offer was structured to require an immediate decision, with acceptance deadlines that prevented careful consideration or consultation with advisors who might identify potential problems. The mining consortium was identified only through a post office box in Denver, providing no information about the individuals or organizations behind the proposal. When her sons returned from their morning work, Sarah gathered them around the kitchen table and shared the contents of the mysterious correspondence. Thomas was the first to voice suspicions that matched her own concerns, his analytical mind immediately identifying the questionable aspects of an offer that seemed designed to pressure rather than persuade. $12,000 for land that everyone says is barely worth $3,000, he said, studying the purchase agreement with growing skepticism. Either someone knows something about our property that we don't know, or this is some kind of scheme to separate us from something valuable. James was more focused on the practical implications of the geological survey mentioned in the territorial. Notice, his experience working their land had given him an intimate knowledge of its features, including areas where unusual rock formations or soil conditions might indicate the presence of valuable minerals. The abandoned copper mines that bordered their property had always seemed like historical curiosities rather than potential assets. But recent research in the town library had revealed that Montana's mineral wealth was far more extensive than most people realized. Samuel, whose quick mind often identified connections that others missed, was the first to suggest a link between the mining consortium's offer and Bull Garrison's recent interest in their family. What if Garrison knows about something valuable on our land? What if his threats about hiring us for cattle drives are really about forcing us to sell so he can claim whatever's hidden here? The possibility that they were caught between competing forces seeking to exploit hidden wealth on their property created a new framework for understanding their recent troubles. The missing cattle, the financial pressures, and the threats against her sons might all be part of a coordinated campaign to force them into a desperate situation where selling would seem like their only option for survival. If that was true, then both Bull Garrison and the mysterious mining consortium were enemies who saw the Mitchell family as obstacles to be removed rather than people deserving fair treatment. Sarah made the decision to investigate the abandoned copper mines that had been part of their property since Robert's original purchase 15 years earlier. The tunnels had been excavated during the territorial mining boom of the 1860s, but were abandoned when the easily accessible ore was exhausted and the costs of deeper excavation exceeded the profits from extraction. Robert had always warned their sons to stay away from the mine entrances, concerned about structural instability and the potential for dangerous gases that might have accumulated in the underground chambers. But financial desperation and growing suspicions about the true value of their land overcame previous cautions about exploring the abandoned workings. If there was even a remote possibility that valuable minerals remained in those dark tunnels, Sarah owed it to her family to investigate before making any decisions about selling their property or accepting Bull Garrison's implied ultimatum about her son's futures. The next morning, Sarah and Thomas set out for the mine entrances armed with lanterns, rope, and basic tools for testing rock samples. The main tunnel opening was located about half a mile from their ranch house, concealed behind a stand of pine trees that had grown up around the entrance during 20 years of abandonment. The wooden support structures built by the original miners appeared solid despite their age, though Sarah insisted on testing each beam and post before trusting their weight to the underground framework. The air inside the tunnel was cool and dry, carrying the faint metallic scent that Sarah remembered from her childhood visits to her uncle's blacksmith shop in Boston. The walls were rough-hewn rock marked with the tool marks of miners who had worked these passages decades earlier, their efforts illuminated by the flickering light of oil lanterns that created dancing shadows on the stone surfaces. About 50 feet into the main tunnel, they encountered the first side passage, a narrow opening that disappeared into darkness beyond the reach of their lantern light. Thomas volunteered to explore the side passage while Sarah remained in the main tunnel, both of them conscious that they were venturing into potentially dangerous territory without proper equipment or experience. The silence of the underground chambers was broken only by the sound of their footsteps and the occasional drip of water seeping through cracks in the stone ceiling. After several minutes, Thomas called out that he had discovered a chamber containing what appeared to be abandoned mining equipment, including tools and/or carts that suggested the original miners had left their work suddenly rather than completing. An orderly shut down. When Sarah joined Thomas in the chamber, her attention was immediately drawn to several large rocks that glittered in the lantern light with a metallic sheen that seemed far too rich to be ordinary stone. Her limited knowledge of geology was insufficient to identify the specific minerals present, but the abundance of what appeared to be metallic veins throughout the chamber walls suggested that the original miners had been extracting something far more valuable than simple copper. Thomas used a hammer to chip samples from several different areas of the chamber, collecting specimens that they could have analyzed by someone with proper expertise. The quantity of potentially valuable material was staggering, with entire walls showing evidence of mineral deposits that appeared to extend deep into the rock formation. If even a fraction of what they were seeing represented precious metals, the value could exceed anything either of them had ever imagined. The discovery of additional chambers containing similar mineral deposits confirmed that the abandoned copper mines contained wealth that had been overlooked or deliberately concealed for decades. Sarah began to understand why the mysterious mining consortium was willing to pay $12,000 for property that appeared to be struggling grazing land, and why Bull Garrison was suddenly interested in controlling her family through threats and intimidation. But the most shocking discovery came when they found evidence that the mines had been active much more recently than anyone realized. Fresh tool marks on the chamber walls, recently used equipment, and signs of systematic extraction suggested that someone had been secretly working the mines within the past few months. The presence of modern mining tools mixed with equipment from the 1860s indicated that current operations were being conducted by people who had access to the property and knowledge of its true value. The realization that unknown parties had been exploiting the mineral wealth beneath her land without her knowledge or consent filled Sarah with a fury that made her previous concerns about financial survival seem insignificant. Someone had been stealing from her family while they struggled to pay basic expenses, extracting valuable resources that rightfully belonged to her sons and their future prosperity. The scope of the theft and deception was breathtaking in its audacity and devastating in its implications for everyone who had been manipulating her family's desperate circumstances. Sarah and Thomas spent the remainder of the day systematically exploring every accessible area of the mine complex, documenting their discoveries and collecting samples that could be analyzed for their true value. The evidence they gathered painted a picture of mineral wealth that extended far beyond the original copper deposits, including what appeared to be significant quantities of silver, gold, and possibly other precious metals that had been overlooked by the miners of the 1860s. The abandoned mines represented not just hidden treasure, but the key to understanding why their family had become the target of increasingly aggressive pressure from forces they were only beginning to identify. The purchase offer from the Western Territory Mining Consortium, Bull Garrison's threats against her sons, and the pattern of harassment that had been escalating over recent months all made sense when viewed as competing efforts to gain control of property containing extraordinary mineral wealth. As Sarah and Thomas rode back to their ranch house that evening, both of them carried samples that might represent the solution to every problem their family had faced since Robert's death. But they also carried the knowledge that they were now engaged in a conflict with enemies who possessed far more resources and fewer scruples than a widow and her 3 sons should reasonably be expected to overcome. The discovery of hidden wealth had transformed their circumstances, but it had also raised the stakes of their survival to levels that could easily prove fatal if they made strategic errors. The conversation with her sons that evening was unlike any Sarah had ever imagined having with her children. Instead of discussing routine ranch operations or planning for seasonal challenges, they found themselves analyzing evidence of theft, conspiracy, and deception that reached far beyond their small corner of Montana territory. Their samples, spread across their kitchen table, represented both salvation and mortal danger, offering the possibility of unprecedented prosperity while attracting the attention of adversaries who would stop at nothing to claim those resources for themselves. Thomas argued for immediate action to establish legal claims to the mineral deposits and seek protection from territorial authorities, believing that official recognition of their rights would provide security against further exploitation. James favored a more cautious approach that involved secretly gathering additional evidence while maintaining the appearance of ignorance about the mine's true value. Samuel suggested that they needed expert analysis of their samples before making any decisions that might reveal the extent of their discovery to potential enemies. Sarah listened to her son's arguments while struggling to process the magnitude of the choice they faced. The conservative path would involve accepting the mining consortium's purchase offer and relocating their family to safety, using the $12,000 to build a new life in an area where powerful enemies had no interest in threatening their welfare. But that option would mean abandoning the mineral wealth that rightfully belonged to them, allowing others to profit from resources that could provide generational prosperity for the Mitchell family. The aggressive path would involve filing mining claims, establishing legal ownership of the mineral deposits, and preparing to defend their rights against adversaries who had already demonstrated their willingness to use intimidation and violence. That choice offered the possibility of extraordinary wealth, but also guaranteed conflict with enemies who possessed superior resources and fewer moral constraints. The middle ground involved keeping their discovery secret while gathering more information about their opponents and potential allies, but that strategy carried its own risks of allowing others to solidify their positions while the Mitchell family remained vulnerable. As night fell over the Montana territory and the family continued their discussions around the kitchen table, Sarah found herself thinking about Robert and wondering what advice he would offer if faced with such an impossible decision. His memories seemed to whisper that the choice was not really between safety and wealth, but between accepting victimization and fighting for justice. The people who had been stealing from their family while they struggled to survive deserved to face consequences for their crimes, regardless of the personal cost to the Mitchell family. The woman who had begun that morning as a struggling widow facing impossible choices was ending the day as the secret owner of mineral wealth that could reshape the economic balance of power throughout the Montana territory. But the transformation from victim to victor would require more than the discovery of hidden treasure. It would demand courage, intelligence, and determination that would test every aspect of her character while determining not just her family's future, but the fate of everyone who had underestimated the strength of a mother fighting to protect her children. The abandoned copper mines had revealed their secrets, but the real battle for control of that wealth was just beginning. Sarah Mitchell was about to discover that possessing a fortune was far less important than having the strength to defend it against enemies who would stop at nothing to claim it for themselves. The revelation that would transform Sarah Mitchell from desperate widow to the most dangerous woman in Montana territory came not from the samples they had collected, but from a discovery hidden beneath decades of accumulated debris in the deepest chamber of the abandoned mines. Thomas had been examining what appeared to be a collapsed section of tunnel when his lantern light caught the edge of something that didn't belong among the natural rock formations and mining equipment left by previous excavations. Careful excavation revealed a metal strongbox that had been deliberately concealed behind a wall of loose stones, its iron construction bearing the distinctive markings of a Denver bank from the 1860s. The lock had been broken long ago, but the contents remained intact, protected from moisture and rodents by the strongbox's tight seal and the dry conditions within the mine chambers. Inside were documents that painted a picture of systematic fraud and conspiracy that reached far beyond anything Sarah had imagined possible. The first document was a geological survey conducted in 1863 by government specialists who had identified the Mitchell property as containing some of the richest mineral deposits in the Montana Territory. According to their detailed analysis, the land contained not just copper, but extensive veins of silver and gold that could be worth millions of dollars when extracted using proper techniques. The survey had been commissioned by the territorial government as part of a comprehensive assessment of Montana's mineral wealth, but its findings had apparently never been made public or shared with the property's owners. More disturbing was a collection of correspondence between territorial officials and representatives of Eastern mining interests, revealing a coordinated plan to suppress information about the area's mineral wealth while systematically acquiring property rights through fraud, intimidation, and manipulation of legal processes. The letters made clear that certain officials had been paid substantial bribes to ensure that valuable properties remained available for purchase by favored companies at prices far below their actual worth. Among the correspondence was a letter, dated 1864, that specifically mentioned the property that would later be purchased by Robert Mitchell, describing it as a priority acquisition target because of its extraordinary mineral potential. The letter indicated that the previous owner had been pressured to sell through a combination of financial manipulation and physical threats, with his departure from the territory being hastily arranged to prevent him from learning about the true value of what he was abandoning. The most shocking revelation came from a detailed accounting ledger that documented the illegal extraction of minerals from various properties throughout the region over a period of several years during the 1860s. The ledger showed that substantial quantities of gold and silver had been secretly removed from the Mitchell property and others, with the profits being divided among a network of corrupt officials, mining company representatives, and local enforcers who provided security for the illegal operations. The final document in the strongbox was a map showing the locations of multiple hidden caches throughout the territory where stolen gold and silver had been stored pending shipment to eastern markets. According to the map, one of these caches was located somewhere on the Mitchell property itself, containing precious metals worth several $100,000 that had been extracted from local mines during the height of the illegal operations. Sarah and Thomas stared at the documents in stunned silence, trying to process the implications of what they had discovered. The evidence in their hands proved that the Mitchell family had been the victims of a criminal conspiracy that had been operating for decades, stealing the rightful inheritance that should have provided prosperity and security for multiple generations. The struggles they had endured since Robert's death, the financial pressures that had threatened to destroy their family, and the current attempts to force them off their land were all connected to efforts to conceal and continue exploiting wealth that legally belonged to them. But the documents also revealed the identity of some of the individuals and organizations responsible for the ongoing theft and deception. The correspondence included references to the Garrison family as reliable local assets who could be counted on to provide enforcement services and intimidation when necessary. Other letters mentioned territorial officials who were still in positions of authority, suggesting that the corruption documented in the 1860s had continued and evolved rather than being eliminated by changes in government. The Western Territory Mining Consortium, which had made the sudden purchase offer for their property, was identified in the documents as a front organization established to facilitate the acquisition of properties containing valuable mineral deposits. The consortium's real owners were Eastern investors who had been exploiting Montana's mineral wealth for decades, while maintaining the appearance of legitimate business operations. Their current interest in the Mitchell property suggested that they were aware of the hidden wealth and were attempting to complete the theft that had been interrupted by Robert's unexpected purchase of the land. Thomas was the first to grasp the full significance of their discovery, understanding that the evidence they now possessed could expose a criminal conspiracy that reached into the highest levels of territorial government. But he also realized that the same evidence made them extraordinarily dangerous to powerful people who had spent decades covering up their crimes and would certainly resort to violence to prevent exposure. "We're not just fighting Bull Garrison anymore," he said quietly, studying the correspondence with growing alarm. "We're up against people with connections in Denver, maybe even Washington. People who have been stealing from families like ours for 20 years and getting away with it because they own the officials who are supposed to protect us." Sarah felt a cold rage building within her as she contemplated the scope of the injustice that had been perpetrated against her family and countless others throughout the territory. The poverty and struggle they had endured were not the result of bad luck or economic circumstances beyond anyone's control, but the deliberate consequences of theft and fraud committed by people who possessed the power to conceal their crimes. The death of her husband, the threats against her sons, and the constant fear that had dominated their lives were all connected to a conspiracy designed to steal their rightful inheritance. But along with rage came a growing sense of empowerment as Sarah began to understand the true value of what they now controlled. The mineral deposits beneath their property, combined with the evidence of decades of illegal extraction, represented wealth that could make the Mitchell family the most powerful force in Montana Territory. More importantly, the documents they had discovered provided the means to expose and destroy the network of corruption that had been exploiting honest families throughout the region. The decision to keep their discovery secret while they developed a strategy for using it effectively required careful planning and absolute discretion. Sarah understood that any premature revelation of what they had learned would likely result in their deaths, as the conspiracy had already demonstrated its willingness to eliminate threats through violence. But she also knew that they could not simply hide their knowledge and hope to be left alone, as their enemies were already moving to complete the theft of their property through legal or illegal means. The first step was to have their or samples analyzed by experts who could provide official documentation of their value. But doing so required finding someone trustworthy who would not betray their secret to the wrong people. Sarah decided to approach Doc Walsh, whose integrity and discretion had been proven over years of friendship, and whose medical background might have provided him with knowledge of chemistry and geology that could be useful in evaluating their discoveries. Doc Walsh's reaction to the ore samples and historical documents exceeded even Sarah's expectations for shock and outrage. His knowledge of chemistry confirmed that the mineral specimens contained extraordinary concentrations of gold and silver, while his familiarity with territorial politics helped him understand the significance of the corruption evidence they had uncovered. But most importantly, his network of contacts throughout the region included individuals who might be able to provide assistance in exposing the conspiracy and protecting the Mitchell family from retaliation. Sarah, what you've discovered here could change the entire balance of power in Montana Territory, Doc Walsh said after studying the documents for several hours. But it could also get you and your boys killed if the wrong people learn about it before you're ready to defend yourselves. These aren't just local criminals you're dealing with. This conspiracy involves people with resources and connections that reach far beyond anything we have here in Copper Ridge. The doctor's assessment confirmed Sarah's own understanding of the dangers they faced, but also reinforced her determination to see justice done regardless of the personal cost. The evidence they possessed represented not just their own salvation, but the key to protecting other families from the same exploitation and theft that had nearly destroyed the Mitchells. The moral obligation to use their knowledge for the greater good was as important as their desire for personal revenge against the people who had wronged them. Doc Walsh agreed to help them develop a strategy that would maximize their chances of survival while ensuring that the criminal conspiracy was exposed and destroyed. His first recommendation was to secretly document everything they had discovered, creating multiple copies of the evidence that could be distributed to trusted allies in case something happened to the original materials. His second suggestion was to identify potential allies among territorial and federal officials who might be willing to take action against the corruption once they were presented with irrefutable proof. The most crucial element of their strategy would be timing, as premature action could allow their enemies to destroy evidence or eliminate witnesses before justice could be served. But delay also carried risks, as the Western Territory Mining Consortium and Bull Garrison were both moving to complete their respective schemes for gaining control of the Mitchell property. The window of opportunity for effective action was narrowing rapidly, requiring decisions that would determine not just their family's fate, but the future of honest government in Montana Territory. Sarah spent the following week carefully studying every document they had discovered while developing plans for using the evidence most effectively. The correspondence revealed the names of specific individuals who had been involved in the conspiracy, including some who were still alive and active in territorial politics. The geological surveys provided technical documentation that could be used to establish the true value of their property and others that had been illegally exploited. The accounting records offered proof of theft that could be used to demand restitution and criminal prosecution. But the most valuable discovery was the map showing the locations of hidden treasure caches throughout the territory. If even one of these caches could be located and recovered, it would provide the financial resources necessary to fund a legal and political campaign against the conspiracy. More importantly, the physical evidence of stolen gold and silver would corroborate the documentary evidence and make denial impossible for the criminals involved. The cache supposedly hidden on the Mitchell property itself became the focus of intensive but discreet searching, as its recovery would provide both immediate financial relief and crucial evidence for their case against the conspiracy. The map indicated that the treasure was buried near a distinctive rock formation about a mile from the main mine entrances, in an area that Sarah and her sons knew well from their years of working the land. The search for the hidden cache required careful planning to avoid attracting attention from potential watchers who might be monitoring their activities. Sarah and her sons took turns conducting seemingly routine ranch work in the area indicated by the map, gradually narrowing down the possible locations while maintaining the appearance of normal daily activities. The distinctive rock formation mentioned in the documents proved to be a natural granite outcropping that had served as a landmark for generations of travelers through the region. After 3 days of careful investigation, Samuel discovered signs of old excavation near the base of the granite outcropping, hidden beneath decades of accumulated soil and vegetation. The depression was barely visible to casual observation, but careful examination revealed evidence of deliberate digging and refilling that suggested human activity rather than natural erosion. More significantly, metal detector equipment borrowed from Doc Walsh confirmed the presence of substantial metallic objects buried several feet below the surface. The excavation of the hidden cache required extreme caution to avoid detection by potential observers, with the work being conducted during pre-dawn hours when visibility was limited and most people were still asleep. What they discovered exceeded their most optimistic expectations, confirming that the conspiracy had indeed been operating on a scale that dwarfed anything they had previously imagined. The cache contained over 200 pounds of refined gold and silver, carefully packaged in waterproof containers that had preserved their condition despite decades of burial. According to the weight and purity markings on the metal bars, the treasure was worth approximately $400,000 at current market prices, representing more wealth than most people in the territory would see in multiple lifetimes. But beyond its monetary value, the cache provided irrefutable physical evidence of the illegal mining operations described in the historical documents. Each bar of precious metal bore distinctive markings that could be traced to specific mines and extraction operations, creating a direct link between the documentary evidence and the physical proof of criminal activity. Some of the markings matched mines that were listed in the territorial records as having been exhausted or abandoned, proving that illegal extraction had continued long after official operations ceased. Other markings corresponded to mines that were still active under different ownership, suggesting that the conspiracy had evolved and continued rather than ending with the conclusion of the original illegal operations. The discovery of the treasure cache transformed the Mitchell family's situation from desperate defense to strategic offense, providing them with the resources necessary to fund their fight against the conspiracy while offering compelling evidence that could convince even skeptical officials to take action. But Sarah understood that possessing such wealth also made them extraordinarily attractive targets for enemies who would stop at nothing to prevent exposure of their crimes. The decision to move the treasure to a secure location required careful planning and absolute secrecy, as any evidence of their discovery could trigger immediate and violent retaliation from the conspiracy. Sarah chose to hide the precious metals in multiple locations throughout their property, reducing the risk of total loss while making it more difficult for enemies to locate and steal their newfound wealth. Some of the gold and silver was concealed in the main house, hidden within walls and beneath floorboards where it would be accessible but unlikely to be discovered by casual searchers. Other portions were buried in remote areas of their ranch, marked with subtle landmarks that only family members would recognize. The transformation of Sarah Mitchell from struggling widow to secret millionaire was complete, but the real test of her character was just beginning. The wealth hidden throughout her property provided the means to fight back against the forces that had been exploiting her family. But using that wealth effectively would require courage, intelligence, and strategic thinking that would determine whether justice would be served or whether the conspiracy would succeed in claiming another victim. The woman who had awakened that morning still worried about meeting basic expenses was ending the day as one of the wealthiest individuals in Montana Territory, possessing not just enormous riches, but the evidence necessary to expose decades of criminal activity. But she was also now the most dangerous person her enemies had ever faced, armed with knowledge and resources that could destroy everyone who had participated in the conspiracy to steal her family's rightful inheritance. The abandoned copper mines had yielded their greatest treasure, but the battle for justice was just beginning. Sarah Mitchell was about to transform from victim to victor, using the very wealth that had been stolen from her family to fund a campaign that would reshape the political and economic landscape of the entire Montana Territory. The poor widow who had been commanded to surrender her sons was about to become the woman who would command the fate of everyone who had underestimated the power of a mother protecting her children. The confrontation that would determine the fate of Montana Territory began on a crisp September morning when Brutus Bull Garrison arrived at the Mitchell homestead with 12 armed men, his massive frame silhouetted against the rising sun. As he dismounted from his stallion with the confidence of a man who had never been denied anything he truly wanted. At 6 feet 8 inches tall and weighing nearly 300 pounds, Garrison commanded attention through sheer physical presence. But it was the cold calculation in his pale blue eyes that made him truly dangerous to anyone who stood in his way. Sarah watched from her kitchen window as the giant cowboy arranged his men in a semicircle around her house, their rifles visible and their intentions unmistakable. This was not a social visit or a business negotiation, but a demonstration of power designed to intimidate her into immediate surrender of everything she had fought to protect. The sight of so many armed men on her property filled her with the familiar fear that had dominated her life since Robert's death. But beneath that terror was a growing flame of rage fueled by the knowledge of what these men truly represented. Her sons were working in the far pasture, safely away from the immediate danger, but close enough to return quickly if summoned. Sarah had planned for this moment during the weeks since discovering the treasure cache and the evidence of conspiracy, developing strategies that would give her family the best chance of survival while ensuring that justice would ultimately be served. The weapons hidden throughout her house, the documents secured in multiple locations, and the allies she had carefully recruited were all part of a plan that would either save her family or ensure that their deaths would not be in vain. Bull Garrison approached her front door with the measured stride of a man confident in his ability to intimidate anyone who opposed him. His expensive boots and tailored coat spoke of wealth and influence that extended far beyond simple cattle ranching, while the gun at his hip was worn with the casual familiarity of someone who had used it frequently and effectively. When he knocked on her door, the sound was firm but not urgent, suggesting that he expected immediate compliance with whatever demands he had come to make. "Mrs. Mitchell," he said when Sarah opened the door, his voice carrying the false courtesy that powerful men often used when dealing with those they considered inferior. "I believe we have some business to discuss that can't wait any longer. May I come in?" Sarah stepped aside to allow him entry, understanding that resistance at this point would only escalate the violence that was already inevitable. Her kitchen seemed smaller with Garrison's massive presence filling the space, his head nearly touching the ceiling beams that Robert had installed 15 years earlier. The giant cowboy took a chair without being invited, his pale eyes scanning the room with the practiced assessment of someone evaluating potential threats and escape routes. "I'll speak plainly, Mrs. Mitchell, because I believe you're an intelligent woman who understands practical realities," Garrison began, his tone suggesting that he was offering generosity rather than making threats. "Your situation here has become untenable. The debts, the missing cattle, the challenges of managing a ranch without proper male supervision. It's time to accept help from people who have the resources to solve your problems." The offer he presented was comprehensive and superficially generous. The Western Territory Mining Consortium would purchase her property for $15,000, substantially more than their previous offer, while Garrison himself would provide employment for her three sons in his expanding cattle operation. The work would be challenging but well compensated, offering opportunities for advancement that could secure their futures in ways that small-scale ranching never could. Sarah would receive enough money to relocate anywhere she chose, perhaps returning to the East where a woman of her background could find appropriate companionship and security. Your boys are strong and capable, Garrison continued, his eyes never leaving Sarah's face as he spoke. They have potential that's being wasted on this hardscrabble operation. I can give them opportunities to become wealthy men, to build something significant instead of just struggling to survive. All I need is your permission to hire them, and your agreement to sell this property to people who can develop it properly. The implicit threats beneath his seemingly reasonable proposal were clear to anyone who understood how Bull Garrison conducted business. Sarah's sons would work for him whether she agreed or not, but their treatment would depend entirely on her cooperation with his plans. Refusal to sell would result in escalating harassment until their financial situation became truly desperate, while continued resistance could lead to accidents that might remove the obstacles to his goals permanently. Sarah listened to his proposal with the appearance of careful consideration, understanding that her response would determine whether the conflict escalated to immediate violence or whether she would have time to implement the strategies she had prepared. The knowledge of the treasure hidden throughout her property and the evidence of conspiracy gave her confidence that she could ultimately prevail, but the immediate challenge was surviving long enough to use those advantages effectively. "Mr. Garrison," she said finally, her voice steady despite the fear that threatened to overwhelm her composure. "Your offer is certainly generous, and I appreciate your concern for my family's welfare. But before I make such an important decision, I need to understand exactly what kind of opportunities you're offering my sons." The question was designed to encourage Garrison to reveal more about his true intentions while buying time for her to assess the tactical situation. The giant cowboy seemed pleased by what he interpreted as willingness to negotiate, his confidence growing as he began describing the work that would be required of young men in his employment. The cattle drives to distant markets were dangerous but profitable, requiring men who could handle themselves in difficult situations and weren't afraid of hard work. The mining operations that were expanding throughout his territory needed workers who could follow orders without asking unnecessary questions about the legal details of their activities. As Garrison spoke, Sarah realized that he was essentially describing a criminal organization that used legitimate business operations as cover for illegal activities ranging from cattle rustling to claim jumping to worse crimes that he didn't name explicitly. Her sons would not be employees but accomplices, their involvement ensuring their silence about activities that could result in federal prosecution if exposed to the wrong authorities. The work would indeed pay well, but the ultimate cost would be their freedom and possibly their lives if the organization was ever investigated by honest law enforcement. The sound of approaching horses interrupted Garrison's sales pitch, causing him to turn toward the window with an expression of annoyance rather than alarm. Sarah recognized the riders as Doc Walsh and Sheriff Coleman, their arrival suggesting that her preparations for this confrontation had been more effective than she had dared hope. The doctor had been working quietly to build support among territorial officials who were not part of the conspiracy, while the sheriff had been presented with evidence that forced him to choose between justice and continued complicity with corruption. "Mrs. Mitchell," Doc Walsh called out as he dismounted near her front porch. "I hope we're not interrupting important business, but we have some urgent matters to discuss that can't wait." Sheriff Coleman's presence was particularly significant because his cooperation had been essential for the conspiracy's success over the years. His decision to accompany Doc Walsh suggested that the evidence Sarah had provided had convinced him that continued alliance with the criminal organization would be more dangerous than switching sides. The badge on his chest represented legitimate law enforcement authority that could challenge even Bull Garrison's apparent impunity. Garrison's reaction to the sheriff's arrival was telling, his confidence wavering for the first time since entering Sarah's house. The giant cowboy understood that his ability to intimidate individual families depended on the assumption that law enforcement would either ignore his activities or actively support them. The presence of Sheriff Coleman at the Mitchell homestead suggested that the political protection he had enjoyed for years might no longer be reliable. Sheriff Coleman, Garrison said carefully, his tone shifting from casual confidence to wary respect. "I wasn't expecting to see you here today. Mrs. Mitchell and I were just discussing some business arrangements that might benefit everyone involved." The sheriff's response made clear that the balance of power in Copper Ridge had shifted dramatically since Garrison's last visit to town. "Mr. Garrison, I'm afraid those business arrangements will have to wait. We've received some serious allegations about illegal mining operations and claim jumping that require immediate investigation. I'm going to need you and your men to return to town for questioning." The confrontation that followed revealed the true character of everyone involved in the conspiracy that had been exploiting Montana territory for decades. Garrison's initial response was to assert his legal and political connections, threatening consequences for anyone who interfered with his legitimate business activities. When those threats failed to intimidate Sheriff Coleman, he shifted to more direct intimidation, reminding the sheriff of the dangerous enemies he would make by pursuing unfounded allegations against respected members of the community. But Sarah had prepared for this moment by ensuring that the evidence against the conspiracy was too overwhelming to ignore and too widely distributed to suppress. The documents she had discovered in the abandoned mines had been copied and shared with federal authorities, territorial officials, and newspaper editors throughout the region. The treasure cache had been documented and photographed, creating irrefutable proof of illegal mining activities that contradicted decades of official denials. Most importantly, Sarah had identified and recruited allies among honest officials who had been unknowingly excluded from the conspiracy because their integrity made them unsuitable for corruption. These men now possessed the evidence and authority necessary to pursue justice regardless of the political connections that had previously protected the criminal organization. The turning point came when Doc Walsh presented Sheriff Coleman with a telegram from the territorial capital authorizing a full investigation of mining fraud allegations and promising federal support for local law enforcement agencies that cooperated with the inquiry. The telegram's contents made clear that the conspiracy's political protection had evaporated, leaving individual participants vulnerable to prosecution under federal laws that carried severe penalties, including lengthy prison sentences and substantial financial penalties. Garrison's men began to lose their confidence as they realized that their employer's apparent invincibility was based on political arrangements that no longer existed. The rifles they carried were useless against federal warrants and territorial investigations that could destroy their lives even if they escaped immediate arrest. The loyalty that Garrison had purchased through intimidation and bribery began to crumble as his employees calculated the personal costs of continued association with a criminal organization that was facing inevitable exposure. The giant cowboy himself seemed to shrink as the reality of his situation became apparent, his massive physical presence unable to compensate for the loss of political protection that had made his criminal empire possible. The man who had terrorized families throughout the territory for years was revealed as a common criminal whose apparent power had depended entirely on the corruption of officials who were now choosing self-preservation over continued complicity. Sarah watched this transformation with a mixture of satisfaction and amazement, hardly able to believe that the man who had threatened her family was being reduced to a desperate fugitive in a matter of minutes. The knowledge that she had been instrumental in orchestrating his downfall filled her with pride, but also with understanding of the enormous responsibility that came with the power she now possessed. The arrest of Bull Garrison and his associates marked the beginning of the largest criminal investigation in Montana Territory's history, as federal authorities used the evidence provided by Sarah to uncover a network of corruption that reached into multiple states and territories. The Western Territory Mining Consortium was exposed as a front organization for illegal mining operations that had stolen millions of dollars worth of precious metals from legitimate property owners throughout the region. The trials that followed dominated newspaper headlines for months, revealing the scope of a conspiracy that had operated with impunity for decades while exploiting honest families and corrupting government institutions. Sarah's testimony was crucial in securing convictions against the primary conspirators, her detailed knowledge of the evidence, and her credible presentation making denial impossible for even the most skilled defense attorneys. But perhaps more important than the criminal prosecutions was the return of stolen wealth to its rightful owners and the establishment of legal precedents that would prevent similar conspiracies in the future. The treasure cache that Sarah had discovered was officially recognized as evidence in federal court, its contents used to provide restitution to families who had been victimized by the illegal mining operations. Additional caches discovered throughout the territory using the map from the strongbox yielded millions of dollars in stolen precious metals that were distributed to legitimate claimants. The Mitchell family's transformation from struggling homesteaders to wealthy landowners was remarkable not just for its scale, but for the responsible way Sarah used her newfound resources. The mineral deposits beneath their property were developed using ethical practices that provided good employment for local workers while generating profits that funded community improvements including schools, medical facilities, and infrastructure projects that benefited everyone in the region. Sarah's three sons grew into leadership roles within the family's expanding business operations, their characters shaped by their mother's example of using wealth and power to serve the greater good rather than simply pursuing personal advantage. Thomas became the manager of their mining operations, implementing safety standards and worker protections that exceeded anything previously seen in the territory. James established a horse breeding program that supplied high-quality animals to ranchers throughout the region, while Samuel pursued legal studies that prepared him to protect other families from the kind of exploitation that had nearly destroyed the Mitchells. The town of Copper Ridge itself was transformed from a struggling frontier settlement into a prosperous community that attracted honest businesses and hardworking families seeking opportunities for advancement. The elimination of corruption and criminal influence created an environment where legitimate enterprises could flourish, while the Mitchell family's investments in local infrastructure provided the foundation for sustained economic growth. Doc Walsh continued his medical practice, but also served as an unofficial advisor to territorial officials working to prevent future corruption scandals. His role in exposing the conspiracy had established his reputation as someone who could be trusted to investigate allegations of criminal activity without regard for the political connections of those involved. Sheriff Coleman was elected to territorial office on a platform of honest government and effective law enforcement. His transformation from reluctant accomplice to active reformer, inspiring other officials to choose integrity over personal advantage. The legacy of Sarah Mitchell's fight against the conspiracy extended far beyond her family's personal circumstances, establishing legal and political precedents that protected honest families throughout the Montana Territory and neighboring regions. Her courage in standing up to seemingly overwhelming opposition inspired other victims of exploitation to seek justice rather than accepting defeat, while the evidence she provided led to reforms in territorial government that made future conspiracies much more difficult to establish and maintain. The woman who had begun as a poor widow facing impossible choices had become a symbol of the strength that ordinary people could find when fighting for justice against corrupt institutions. Her story was repeated in newspapers throughout the West, inspiring families in similar circumstances to resist intimidation and seek help from honest authorities who were willing to pursue justice regardless of the political consequences. Years later, as Sarah sat on the porch of her expanded ranch house watching her grandchildren play in the yard where she had once feared for her family's survival, she reflected on the journey that had transformed her from victim to victor. The gold locket at her throat still contained Robert's photograph, but now it also held pictures of their children and grandchildren who would inherit not just wealth, but a legacy of courage and integrity that would guide their decisions for generations to come. The abandoned copper mines that had revealed their secrets were now the foundation of a legitimate mining operation that provided prosperity for hundreds of families while setting new standards for ethical business practices. The mountain of evidence that had once seemed like an overwhelming burden had become the cornerstone of legal reforms that protected honest people throughout the territory. The enemies who had once seemed invincible had been revealed as common criminals whose apparent power had depended entirely on the silence and fear of their victims. The transformation was complete, but the responsibility continued. Sarah Mitchell had learned that true victory came not just from defeating enemies, but from using that victory to build something better for future generations. The poor widow who had been commanded to surrender her sons had become the woman who commanded respect throughout Montana Territory, her name synonymous with the courage to fight for justice regardless of the personal cost. The giant cowboy who had once threatened to take everything she held dear was serving a life sentence in federal prison, his criminal empire dismantled, and his stolen wealth returned to its rightful owners. The conspiracy that had exploited honest families for decades had been destroyed, its leaders facing justice and its victims receiving compensation for their losses. The territorial government had been reformed, honest officials had replaced corrupt ones, and legal protections had been established to prevent future exploitation. But perhaps most importantly, Sarah Mitchell had proven that ordinary people possessed the strength to overcome seemingly impossible odds when they refused to accept injustice and were willing to fight for what was right. Her story became part of the legend of the American West, a testament to the power of courage, determination, and moral conviction to triumph over corruption and evil. The poor widow had become a wealthy matriarch, the struggling homestead had become a prosperous ranch, and the three sons who had been threatened with exploitation had become leaders in their community. The transformation was complete, the victory was absolute, and the legacy would endure for generations to come. The morning sun cast golden rays across the valley as Sarah Mitchell stood on the wraparound porch of her grand new ranch house, watching her three sons ride toward the horizon on business that would have been unimaginable just 2 years earlier. Thomas was heading to Helena to finalize contracts with territorial officials for expanding their mining operations, his saddlebags containing legal documents that established the Mitchell family as the largest legitimate mining concern in Montana Territory. James rode toward the eastern pastures to inspect the prize stallions that had made their horse breeding program the most sought-after source of quality livestock in 3 territories. Samuel, now 18 and possessed of a sharp legal mind that impressed even seasoned attorneys, was bound for the county courthouse where he would represent smaller ranchers in disputes against the remnants of corrupt organizations that still occasionally surfaced. The transformation of the Mitchell homestead defied every expectation that the residents of Copper Ridge had held about the poor widow and her struggling family. Where once stood a modest ranch house with patched walls and a leaking roof, now rose a magnificent 2-story structure built from locally quarried stone and timber harvested from their own expanded property. The house featured modern conveniences that were rare even in established eastern cities, including indoor plumbing supplied by an artesian well, gas lighting throughout all rooms, and a telephone connection that linked them directly to business associates in Denver, San Francisco, and even New York. The grounds surrounding the main house reflected the same attention to quality and permanence that characterized every aspect of the Mitchell family's new circumstances. Formal gardens designed by a landscape architect from Chicago provided year-round beauty, while practical considerations were addressed through expanded barns, workshops, and storage facilities that supported their diversified business operations. A private railroad siding connected their property directly to the transcontinental line, allowing efficient shipment of precious metals, livestock, and agricultural products to markets throughout the nation. But perhaps the most remarkable transformation was visible in Sarah herself, whose bearing and appearance now reflected the confidence and authority that came with being one of the most powerful women west of the Mississippi River. The simple, black dress and mended boots of her widowhood had been replaced by elegant clothing tailored by the finest seamstresses in San Francisco, while her prematurely gray hair was now styled in the sophisticated fashion favored by wealthy Eastern society. Women. The gold locket at her throat remained, but it was now complemented by jewelry that included diamonds, emeralds, and other precious stones extracted from their own mines. Yet beneath the external manifestations of wealth and success, Sarah remained fundamentally unchanged in her values and priorities. The money and power she now commanded were tools for protecting her family and serving her community rather than ends in themselves. Every business decision was evaluated not just for its profitability, but for its impact on the working families who depended on Mitchell Enterprises for their livelihoods. Every expansion of their operations included provisions for worker safety, fair wages, and opportunities for advancement that were unprecedented in the often brutal world of frontier industry. The morning's correspondence, delivered by the private courier service that connected their ranch to the outside world, included letters that demonstrated the scope of influence the Mitchell family now wielded throughout the American West. Territorial. Governors sought their advice on economic development policies. Federal officials consulted them regarding mining regulations, and business leaders from across the nation proposed partnerships that could benefit from their expertise and resources. But the letter that brought Sarah the greatest satisfaction was from a widow in Wyoming Territory who had successfully defended her property against claim jumpers using legal strategies developed and funded by the Mitchell Foundation for Frontier Justice. The establishment of the foundation represented Sarah's determination to ensure that other families would never face the kind of exploitation and intimidation that had nearly destroyed her own. Staffed by attorneys, investigators, and community organizers who shared her commitment to protecting honest working families, the foundation provided legal assistance, financial support, and practical guidance to victims of corruption and criminal conspiracy throughout the Western Territories. The organization's successes had made it a model for similar efforts in other regions, while its failures provided valuable lessons for improving future interventions. Rebecca Walsh approached the main house from the direction of the medical clinic that her father had established with Mitchell funding, her purposeful stride and confident bearing reflecting the remarkable young woman she had become under Sarah's mentorship. At 19, Rebecca possessed not only the classical education her father had insisted upon, but also practical experience in business management, community organization, and social reform that prepared her for leadership roles that few women of any background could hope to attain. Her engagement to Thomas had been announced the previous spring, cementing an alliance between families whose shared values and complementary skills promised to benefit the entire territory. "Good morning, Mrs. Mitchell," Rebecca said as she climbed the porch steps, her voice carrying the warmth of genuine affection rather than mere politeness. "Father asked me to update you on the progress of the hospital construction and to discuss some staffing decisions that require your input." The construction of the Regional Medical Center represented one of Sarah's most ambitious philanthropic projects, a state-of-the-art facility that would provide advanced medical care to residents of 5 counties while serving as a training center for doctors and nurses who would staff smaller clinics throughout the frontier. The hospital was designed to accommodate not just immediate medical needs, but also the research and education functions that would advance medical knowledge in areas specifically relevant to frontier conditions and occupational hazards common in mining and ranching operations. Rebecca's report confirmed that construction was proceeding ahead of schedule and under budget, thanks to the skilled craftsmen and quality materials that Mitchell Resources could command. The medical equipment being imported from Eastern manufacturers represented the most advanced technology available, while the library and laboratory facilities would rival those found in major urban medical centers. Most importantly, the staffing plan included provisions for training local residents in basic medical skills, creating a network of capable practitioners who could provide emergency care in remote areas where professional physicians were not readily available. The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of a dust-covered rider whose urgent demeanor suggested news that could not wait for normal business hours. The man was one of the scouts that Sarah employed to monitor activities throughout the territory, particularly in areas where remnants of the old criminal organizations might be attempting to re-establish their operations. His reports over the past year had documented a pattern of isolated incidents that suggested some former associates of Garrison were testing the resolve of territorial authorities to maintain the reforms that had followed the conspiracies. Exposure. "Mrs. Mitchell," the scout called out as he dismounted near the porch, his horse lathered with sweat from hard riding through the mountain passes. "We've got trouble brewing down in Silver Creek County. Group of men claiming to represent Eastern investors have been pressuring homesteaders to sell their properties, using methods that sound mighty familiar to what we dealt with here." The news was troubling but not entirely unexpected, as Sarah had anticipated that the elimination of one criminal organization would eventually lead to attempts by others to fill the void. The patterns described by the scout matched the early stages of the conspiracy that had nearly destroyed her own family, suggesting that lessons learned from that experience could be applied to prevent similar exploitation of other honest families. Sarah's response demonstrated the transformation from reactive victim to proactive protector that characterized her new role in territorial affairs. Within hours, she had dispatched investigators to gather detailed information about the situation in Silver Creek County, arranged for legal assistance to be provided to threatened homesteaders, and coordinated with territorial authorities to ensure that official law enforcement resources would be available if needed. The Mitchell Foundation's Rapid Response Team, composed of experienced attorneys and trained security personnel, was mobilized to provide immediate support to families facing intimidation and fraud. But perhaps most importantly, Sarah's network of business associates and political allies was activated to address the broader implications of renewed criminal activity in the region. The success of previous reforms had created expectations among honest residents that corruption and exploitation would no longer be tolerated, making it essential that swift and decisive action be taken against any attempts to resurrect the old systems of organized criminality. The coordination required to address the Silver Creek situation revealed the remarkable infrastructure that Sarah had built over the past 2 years, transforming the Mitchell family from isolated homesteaders into the center of a regional network dedicated to protecting frontier families and promoting legitimate economic development. The telegraph lines that connected their ranch to population centers throughout the territory carried not just business communications, but also intelligence reports, legal notifications, and coordination messages that enabled rapid response to threats against honest working families. The private security force that protected Mitchell interests had evolved far beyond simple ranch guards into a professional organization that could investigate complex financial crimes, provide personal protection for threatened individuals, and coordinate with official law enforcement agencies when situations required legal intervention. The men who served in these roles were selected not just for their courage and competence, but also for their commitment to the ethical principles that guided all Mitchell enterprises. The economic leverage that the Mitchell family could bring to bear against criminal organizations was equally impressive, as their business relationships with banks, railroads, mining companies, and agricultural concerns throughout the region created opportunities to isolate and pressure criminal enterprises while supporting honest competitors. The threat of being cut off from legitimate business networks often proved more effective than legal prosecution in convincing marginal operators to abandon questionable practices and adopt ethical business methods. As the day progressed and reports arrived from Silver Creek County, Sarah found herself coordinating a complex response that involved multiple levels of government, numerous business organizations, and dozens of community leaders who shared her commitment to maintaining the reforms that had transformed Montana Territory from a region dominated by corruption into a model of honest governance and legitimate economic development. The scope of the operation demonstrated how far her influence had expanded beyond the boundaries of her own property and immediate business interests. The evening brought her sons home from their respective missions, their reports confirming the continued success of Mitchell Enterprises while also revealing new opportunities for expansion and community service. Thomas had secured contracts that would double their mining output over the next 2 years, but more importantly, he had negotiated provisions that would fund additional schools and medical facilities in mining communities throughout the territory. James had finalized agreements with ranchers in 4 states who would purchase breeding stock from their horse operations, creating a steady income stream that would support hundreds of local jobs while establishing the Mitchell brand as synonymous with quality and reliability. Samuel's legal work had resulted in favorable settlements for 3 families who had been victimized by fraudulent land schemes, recovering not just their property, but also financial damages that would compensate them for their losses and suffering. His growing reputation as an attorney who could not be intimidated or corrupted had attracted clients from throughout the region, creating opportunities to identify and disrupt criminal activities before they could cause significant harm to honest families. The family dinner that evening took place in the elegant dining room of their new home, illuminated by crystal chandeliers, and served on china that had been specially ordered from European manufacturers. But the conversation around the table focused not on luxury and comfort, but on the responsibilities that came with their wealth and influence. Each family member reported on their activities and discussed plans for using their resources to benefit the broader community, continuing the tradition of service that had guided their decisions since discovering the treasure that transformed their circumstances. Rebecca's presence at the table as Thomas's fiancée added another perspective to their discussions, her insights into medical and educational needs throughout the territory, helping to inform decisions about philanthropic priorities and community development projects. Her father's work at the medical clinic had provided her with detailed knowledge of health challenges facing frontier families, while her involvement in establishing schools for children in remote areas had revealed the hunger for education that existed among families who had been denied such opportunities by previous generations of exploitation and neglect. The conversation inevitably turned to the situation developing in Silver Creek County, as reports from their investigators painted a picture of organized intimidation that closely resembled the early stages of the conspiracy that had once threatened the Mitchell family. The leaders of the criminal enterprise appeared to be former associates of Bull Garrison who had avoided prosecution by maintaining lower profiles during the federal investigations, but who were now attempting to establish their own territory for exploitation and theft. Sarah's analysis of the situation revealed the strategic thinking that had made her such a formidable opponent of criminal organizations throughout the region. The Silver Creek operation was not just an isolated incident, but part of a broader pattern of attempts to test the resolve of reformed territorial authorities and identify areas where corruption might be reintroduced without immediate consequences. Allowing the criminal enterprise to establish itself would encourage similar attempts in other areas, potentially undermining the entire foundation of honest governance that had been built through such tremendous effort and sacrifice. The decision to intervene decisively in Silver Creek County was unanimous among the family members, who understood that their wealth and influence created obligations to protect families who lacked the resources to defend themselves against organized criminal activity. But the intervention would be conducted using methods that were both legal and ethical, demonstrating that justice could be achieved without resorting to the violence and corruption that characterized their enemies. The strategy that emerged from their discussions combined legal action, economic pressure, political influence, and community organization in a coordinated campaign designed to expose and eliminate the criminal enterprise while strengthening the legitimate institutions that could prevent future incidents. The Mitchell Foundation would provide legal representation for threatened homesteaders, while Mitchell business interests would work with honest local merchants to isolate criminal operators from essential services and supplies. Territorial authorities would be provided with detailed evidence of criminal activities, supported by Mitchell-funded investigators who could gather information and testimony that might otherwise be suppressed through intimidation or bribery. Community leaders throughout Silver Creek County would receive financial and organizational support to establish citizen groups capable of monitoring suspicious activities and coordinating with law enforcement agencies when intervention was needed. The campaign that followed over the next several months demonstrated the effectiveness of the network that Sarah had built for protecting honest families throughout the Montana Territory. The criminal enterprise in Silver Creek County was systematically dismantled through a combination of legal prosecutions, economic isolation, and community resistance that made their operations impossible to sustain. The leaders were arrested and prosecuted under federal laws that carried severe penalties, while their associates either fled the territory or abandoned criminal activities in favor of legitimate employment. But perhaps more importantly, the successful intervention in Silver Creek County established precedents and procedures that could be applied to future threats against honest working families throughout the region. The network of investigators, attorneys, security personnel, and community organizers that had been mobilized for the campaign remained active and alert, creating a permanent capability for detecting and responding to criminal conspiracies before they could cause significant harm. The transformation of Montana Territory from a region plagued by corruption and exploitation into a model of honest governance and legitimate economic development was now complete, with the Mitchell family serving as both catalyst and guardian of the reforms that had made such progress possible. Sarah's journey from struggling widow to powerful protector of frontier families had created a legacy that would endure for generations, inspiring other communities to resist corruption and demand accountability from their leaders. As winter approached and Sarah stood once again on the porch of her home, watching the sunset paint the mountains in shades of gold and crimson, she reflected on the remarkable changes that had transformed not just her family's circumstances, but the entire social and economic landscape of the region. The poor widow who had once feared for her son's safety was now the most respected woman in Montana Territory, her name synonymous with courage, integrity, and determination to protect innocent families from exploitation. The wealth that had been hidden beneath her property for decades was now being used to build schools, hospitals, churches, and other institutions that would serve frontier communities for generations to come. The criminal organizations that had once seemed invincible had been destroyed or driven away, replaced by honest businesses and legitimate government institutions that served the public interest rather than private greed. Her three sons had grown into men of character and capability, prepared to continue the work of building a better society while maintaining the values that had guided their family through its greatest challenges. Thomas would soon marry Rebecca Walsh, uniting two families whose shared commitment to service and integrity promised to benefit the entire territory. James had established himself as the premier horse breeder in the region while also serving as a leader in agricultural development and conservation efforts. Samuel was already being mentioned as a potential candidate for territorial office, his legal skills and uncompromising ethics making him an attractive choice for voters who had grown tired of corruption and incompetence. The foundation that bore the Mitchell name had become a model for similar organizations throughout the American West, providing assistance to hundreds of families who faced challenges similar to those that had once threatened Sarah's own survival. The legal precedents established through Mitchell-funded cases had strengthened protections for honest working families, while making it more difficult for criminal organizations to operate with impunity. But perhaps the most significant legacy of Sarah Mitchell's transformation was the inspiration her story provided to other women facing seemingly impossible challenges. Throughout the territories, widows and single mothers who had been written off as helpless victims found courage in her example to fight for their families' rights and dignity. The precedent she had established showed that ordinary people possessed extraordinary strength when they refused to accept injustice and were willing to sacrifice everything in defense of what they held dear. The giant cowboy who had once commanded her to surrender her sons was now serving a life sentence in federal prison, his criminal empire dismantled and his stolen wealth returned to its rightful owners. The conspiracy that had exploited honest families for decades had been completely destroyed, its leaders facing justice and its victims receiving compensation for their losses. The territorial government had been thoroughly reformed, with honest officials replacing corrupt ones and new legal protections preventing future exploitation. The poor widow had become a wealthy philanthropist, the struggling homestead had become a prosperous enterprise, and the three sons who had been threatened with exploitation had become leaders in their community and guardians of the values that had guided their family through its greatest trials. The transformation was absolute, the victory was permanent, and the legacy would inspire future generations to believe that courage and determination could overcome any obstacle. As the stars emerged in the Montana sky and Sarah prepared to enter the warm comfort of her magnificent home, she touched the gold locket at her throat and whispered a prayer of gratitude for the strength that had carried her family through darkness into light. The photograph of Robert inside the locket seemed to smile with approval for the woman his wife had become and the legacy their children would inherit. The abandoned copper mines that had revealed their secrets now supported legitimate operations that provided good employment for hundreds of families while generating profits that funded community improvements throughout the region. The evidence of conspiracy that had once seemed overwhelming was now safely stored in archives that would remind future generations of the importance of eternal vigilance against corruption and exploitation. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and new opportunities to serve the community that had supported her family through its greatest struggles. But tonight, Sarah Mitchell could rest in the knowledge that she had fulfilled every obligation to her husband's memory, her children's future, and the countless families who had looked to her for protection and leadership. The woman who had been commanded to surrender everything had instead chosen to fight for justice, transforming herself from victim to victor while building a legacy that would endure long after her own story had passed into legend. The giant cowboy's command had been answered not with submission but with strength, proving that the power of a mother's love could overcome any force that threatened her children's welfare and future prosperity. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.